Gideon Cross had killed 4 men. He was not proud of it. He was not ashamed of it either, which was, he had come to understand, the more troubling fact. He crouched in the mud of Red Rock's main street, with a child's thin hands wrapped around his rough ones, and her tear-streaked face looking up at him. And every man on that street had walked past her. Every merchant, every rancher, every church-going husband with a wife on his arm and a Bible verse still warm in his mouth from Sunday morning. Every single one of them had looked at this little girl sitting in the mud with her hands out and her eyes desperate, and they had walked around her like she was a stone in the road. And then Gideon Cross, whose name was on a wanted poster in 4 territories, and whose hands had done things that kept him awake in the small hours. Why, Gideon Cross had stopped. He had not planned to stop. He never planned anything good. The good things happened to him sideways, like weather. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from tonight. Doesn't matter where you are. It matters that you're here. Subscribe if this is your first time, and stay with this story all the way to the end. Because what this child was holding in her hands when she reached for him, and what it cost him to take it, will follow you long after the screen goes dark. 4 days before that. That was where it started. Gideon Cross rode into Red Rock, Colorado on a Tuesday in late October with a gray horse, a bad reputation, and the specific kind of hunger that comes from 3 days of not eating on principle because eating costs money, and money costs decisions he hadn't wanted to make yet. Red Rock was the kind of town that looked, from a distance, like it might be something. Up close, it was mud and lumber, and the smell of horses and whiskey and ambition that had run out somewhere around the second winter. He tied the gray at the rail outside the saloon. He went in. He ordered 1 whiskey, because 1 whiskey was all he was going to allow himself. And he sat at the far end of the bar, where his back was against the wall and his eyes were on the door, which was the only way Gideon Cross ever sat anywhere. The barkeep was a wide man named Dutch, who had the particular face of someone who had heard every story and been surprised by none of them in a very long time. He set the whiskey down. He looked at Gideon's coat. He looked at the revolver on Gideon's hip. He did not say anything, which was the correct response. Gideon drank the whiskey. He sat. He listened to the room the way he always listened, not to the words, but to the shape of them, to what the silences between the words were holding. What he heard after about 10 minutes was a name. Harlan Veitch. He heard it twice, then a 3rd time. Each time in a different corner of the room, from a different mouth, with the same particular lowering of the voice that men use when they're saying the name of someone they are afraid of, but are trying to sound like they aren't. Gideon finished his whiskey. He set the glass down. He said to Dutch quietly, "Who is Harlan Veitch?" Dutch looked at him for a long moment. He picked up a glass and wiped it with a rag that did not appear to be making it cleaner. He said, "Man who owns this town." Gideon said, "I see a mayor's office on the way in." Dutch said, "Yes, sir. There is a mayor's office." Gideon said, "That man isn't the mayor." Dutch wiped the glass. He said, "That man owns the mayor." Gideon nodded slowly. He said, "What does Harlan Veitch want with a town like this?" Dutch set the glass down. He said, "What does any man want with anything? He wants it because it's there, and because he can have it, and because nobody's told him he can't." Gideon put a coin on the bar. He stood up. He said, "Much obliged." He walked out. He did not yet know that Harlan Veitch was the reason the little girl was sitting in the mud. He did not yet know a lot of things. He was about to start learning them faster than he'd have preferred. He found lodging at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who charged 40 cents a night and asked no questions, which was exactly the rate and the policy he was looking for. His room was small and cold, and had a window that looked out onto the main street. And he lay on the narrow bed that first night and stared at the ceiling and thought about the name Harlan Veitch with the particular attention he gave to things that were going to become problems. He had not come to Red Rock for Harlan Veitch. He had come to Red Rock because Red Rock was between where he'd been and where he was going, and his horse had needed rest. That was all. That was the whole of it. He told himself this twice. The second time, he almost believed it. He went to sleep, and he dreamed about Laredo. He always dreamed about Laredo. The second morning, he saw her for the first time. He was coming out of the dry goods store where he had spent the last of his immediate money on coffee and a small portion of dried beans, which was not a glamorous breakfast, but was better than the alternative. And she was across the street, standing at the edge of the boardwalk with her hand out. She was small, 7 years old, maybe 8, the kind of age that's hard to read when a child has been hungry for a while, because hunger takes years off a face and puts decades in the eyes. Her dress was the color mud gets when it's had a long time to become the dress. Her hair was loose and tangled, and her feet, he saw, were bare on the October boardwalk. Bare in October. She had her hand out to a man passing by. The man looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He walked around her. She turned. She put her hand out to the next man. He crossed the street to avoid her. A woman in a good coat came out of the millinery. The girl stepped toward her. The woman pulled her coat closed and walked past without slowing. Gideon Cross stood on his side of the street and watched the main street of Red Rock, Colorado, walk past a barefoot, hungry child for the better part of 5 minutes, and not one person stopped. He crossed the street. He did not cross it fast. He crossed it the way he did most things, deliberately, at his own pace, as though the world could wait for him or not. But he was going to proceed, at the rate he proceeded regardless. He crouched down in the mud in front of her. She flinched back. Both hands came up in front of her face. The flinch of someone who had learned that a hand coming down fast usually meant something bad. He stopped moving. He crouched very still. "Easy," he said. "Easy, ma'am. I ain't gonna touch you. I ain't gonna grab you. I am just gonna stay right here until you decide what you want to do. You can walk away anytime. You understand me?" She lowered her hands slowly. She looked at him. She had green eyes. He noticed that the way you notice something that doesn't fit, that stops you in the middle of a thought. Green eyes, and a face that was trying very hard to be unafraid and not entirely succeeding. "You're hungry," he said. It was not a question. She did not answer. "When's the last time you ate something?" "Nothing." He reached into his coat pocket slowly, making sure she could see exactly what he was doing and where his hands were every second. He came out with one of the dried biscuits Mrs. Aldridge put out in the mornings, which he had put in his pocket without thinking about it, the way he did small, useful things without planning them. He set it on the boardwalk between them. He took his hand away. She looked at the biscuit. She looked at him. She looked at the biscuit again. He stood up. He took 2 full steps back. She picked it up. She ate it in 4 bites, the careful, measured bites of someone rationing something they know has a bottom. He said, "Is there more where you came from?" Meaning other children. He'd learned to ask that early. Hungry children alone in streets were rarely as alone as they looked. She looked at him. Her jaw stopped moving. He said, "I ain't gonna hurt anybody. I ain't gonna tell anybody. You got my word on that, and my word is about the only currency I got left that's still worth the spending." She swallowed. She said 1 word, quiet as a breath between boards. 2. 2 more, he said. She nodded. He said, "You bring them here. I'll be back in 10 minutes. He turned toward the dry goods store. She said, "Mister?" He stopped. "Why?" she said. He turned back. She was looking at him with those green eyes, steady now, The fear moved aside to make room for something more practical, which was suspicion. "Why are you helping us?" Gideon Cross thought about that for a moment. He said, "Honestly, ma'am, I stopped figuring out my reasons about 3 years ago. I just do the thing and then I figure out why later." He paused. "Does the why matter if the biscuit's real?" She looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned and walked down the alley between the millinery and the surveyor's office. He watched her go, and then he went into the dry goods store and bought everything he could carry for the amount of money he had left, which was less than he'd have liked, and more than nothing. And he was back on the boardwalk in 8 minutes, not 10, because some things don't deserve to be made to wait. There were 3 of them, which he'd half expected, because the world had a particular sense of humor about these things. The girl who'd been begging, whose name he did not yet know. A boy, younger, maybe 5, with his sister's same green eyes and a cut above his eyebrow that was a week old and healing wrong. And a second girl, older, 11 or 12, standing slightly in front of the other 2 with her arms loose at her sides and her eyes reading him the way a much older person reads a room before deciding whether to stay in it. The older girl said, before he'd set anything down, "You got a star?" "No, ma'am." "You want something from us?" "No, ma'am. Men don't give things for nothing." Gideon crouched down and set the food on the ground between them. "Some do," he said. "Not many, but some." The older girl looked at the food. She looked at him. She said, "Who are you?" "My name's Gideon," she said. "That's a Bible name." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My mother had hopes." The younger girl touched the older one's sleeve. The older girl looked at her. Something passed between them in the way things pass between siblings who have learned to talk without words. The older girl crouched down and picked up the food and handed it to the younger girl and the boy. She did not take a portion for herself. Gideon noticed this. "You eat too," he said. She said, "I'm not hungry." He said, "You are. But you've been giving your share to them. I understand that. But you won't be any good to them if you fall down." She looked at him, sharp, assessing. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I've done it." He said it plain and flat, without sentiment, which was the only way it would land with this particular child. She took a portion of the food. He sat on the ground of the alley in the cold October mud, in his coat that had seen better decades, and he watched 3 children eat, and he felt the familiar sensation of the world narrowing down to what was right in front of him, which was always how he knew he was in trouble. "What are your names?" he said. The older girl said, "I'm June. She's Wren. He's Callum." He said, "Where are your parents, June?" June ate her biscuit. She said, "Gone." He said, "Gone how?" She said, "Gone like people go when Harlan Veitch decides they should go." The alley was quiet. Somewhere on the main street a horse stamped, and a door opened and closed. Gideon Cross said, "Tell me." June Webb told him the way children tell things when they've been carrying them so long, the weight has become ordinary, without drama, without tears, in the flat voice of someone reporting weather. Their father, Thomas Webb, had owned 40 acres on the eastern edge of Red Rock. Good land, creek-fed, with a house that Thomas had built himself, and a small herd that he'd built over 6 years from nothing to something worth having. Harlan Veitch had wanted the land. The creek that ran through it fed 3 of Veitch's other properties. Without it, those properties were worth less. With it, they were worth considerably more. Veitch had offered to buy. Thomas had declined. Veitch had offered again. Less money, more pressure. Thomas had gone to the marshal. The marshal, as it turned out, had a particular relationship with Harlan Veitch that had more to do with money than with law. 3 months ago, Thomas Webb had ridden out to the east pasture on a Tuesday morning and had not come back. They'd found his horse 2 days later with an empty saddle. They had not found Thomas. Their mother, Margaret, had taken the children to town. She had gone to the marshal. The marshal had told her that her husband had likely run off, which was a thing that men did, and that she should consider her situation carefully and perhaps speak with Mr. Veitch about the property, which could be resolved simply and quickly, and in a way that would provide for her and her children going forward. Margaret Webb had not spoken with Harlan Veitch. Margaret Webb had instead written a letter to the territorial marshal in Denver and sent it with a rider she'd paid with the last of her cash money. 4 weeks ago, 2 men had come to the house. June did not know their names. They were not the local marshal. They were something else, something without a star or a title, which was worse. Margaret had sent the children out the back window. She had told June to take Wren and Callum and run, and not stop, and not come back. June had taken them. She had run. She had not stopped. She had not gone back. Not because she hadn't wanted to, but because when she'd crept back to the edge of town that same night, the house was on fire. She said this the way she said everything, without expression, without tears, in the voice of a girl who had used up her tears on the first night and had not had the resources to make more since. Gideon sat in the mud of the alley and let the story settle into him, the way cold settles into bones, quietly and completely, and without asking permission. He said, "That was 4 weeks ago." June said, "Yes." He said, "You've been in this town for 4 weeks. Sleeping where?" she said. "Wherever." He said, "Eating what?" She didn't answer. He said, "June." She said, "What we could find. What Wren could get from the barrel behind Pemberton's. What I could get when nobody was looking." Gideon Cross looked at the 3 children in the alley of a town that had watched their father disappear and their mother's house burn, and had walked past their outstretched hands for 4 weeks without stopping. He said, "Is there anybody in this town who's on your side?" June said, "There was a woman. Mrs. Lund at the boarding house. She let us sleep in her barn 2 weeks ago when it got cold. She said she couldn't feed us. She said she was sorry. She was scared." He said, "Of Veitch, of everyone that works for Veitch, which is most everyone." June paused. "Mr. Cross," he said, "Gideon." She said, "Gideon. Why did you stop?" "On the street. Wren said you just stopped and walked over. All those other men walked by. Why did you stop?" He thought about it. He said, "Honestly, ma'am, I think it's because I've been every version of the man that walks past. I've been the man that looks away and keeps walking. I know what that costs." He looked at Wren, who was sharing the last of the biscuit with Callum without being asked. "I couldn't pay it again." June looked at him for a long time. She was 12 years old with the eyes of someone 3 times that. She said, "Are you going to help us?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "It's going to be dangerous." He said, "Most things worth doing are." She said, "You could get killed." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you're still going to do it?" He said, "I already decided, ma'am. I decided when I walked across the street. I'm just catching up to the decision now." He started that afternoon. Not with Veitch, with the letter. June had remembered what her mother had written, more or less, because Margaret Webb had read it aloud to her oldest daughter, in the particular way that parents read important things to their children when they suspect they might not be around to remind them later. She'd written to the territorial marshal in Denver, a man named Whitmore, and she'd described the disappearance of Thomas Webb and the visits from Veitch's men and the burning, and she'd asked for help in the specific formal language that June could half remember and half reconstruct. Gideon sat in Mrs. Aldridge's kitchen that evening and wrote the letter again. Not from Margaret, from himself. He included his name, which was a decision that cost him something, because his name on a letter to a federal marshal was not without complications. He included what June had told him, and he included the specific details that June remembered. The names of Veitch's men who had come to the house, the marshal's name, the date of Thomas Webb's disappearance, the location of the property. He sealed it. He paid a boy 2 cents to ride it to the postal office in the next town, where it would not go through Red Rock's hands before it went east. That was day 1. Day 2, he went to see the preacher. Reverend Aldous Crane ran the only church in Red Rock from a building that had been optimistically designed for a congregation 3 times the size of the one that actually showed up on Sundays. He was a thin, angular man with ink-stained fingers and the wary eyes of someone who had been told by God to do right and by Harlan Veitch to do profitable, and had spent several years trying to reconcile the two without much success. He looked at Gideon Cross sitting across from him in the church's cold front room, and he said, "I know who you are," Gideon said. "Then you know I'm not someone you want to cross," Crane said. "Are you threatening me?" Gideon said, "I'm establishing a baseline, Reverend." He paused. "I know about the Webb family. I know what happened to Thomas Webb, and I know what happened to his wife. And I know that 3 children have been sleeping in alleys and eating from barrels in this town for 4 weeks, while everybody, including the man of God, has looked the other way." He said it without heat, just flatly. The way you state facts. Crane's ink-stained hands folded on the table in front of him. He said, "Mr. Cross, what Harlan Veitch does in this town," Gideon said, "is allowed by the silence of people like you." "Yes, sir. I know." Crane said, "You don't understand what he's capable of," Gideon said. "I understand exactly what he's capable of. I've met men like him in 6 territories. I know the specific shape of it." He paused. "What I'm here to ask you, Reverend, is not for courage. I can see you don't have a great deal of that to spare right now, and I'm not going to pretend it's a simple thing to find. What I'm asking you for is information. What you know about Veitch's land dealings. Who else in this town he's moved on? Who else has lost something and is angry enough about it to say so if somebody else says it first?" Crane was quiet. He looked at the cross on the wall behind Gideon's head for a long moment, as though it might offer instruction. He said, "There are 3 other families, 3 that I know of personally. The Harker family lost their grazing rights 2 years ago. Van Veitch had the deed redrawn. Old man Harker took it to the county judge, and the county judge found in Veitch's favor. Silas Drum had a water claim on the North Creek that Veitch's lawyer tied up in so much paper that Silas couldn't afford to fight it. And a man named Peralta, who ran cattle on the Mesa land. Veitch's men burned his fences 3 times, until Peralta sold for 10 cents on the dollar." Gideon said, "They still in town?" Crane said, "Harker is." Drum left. Peralta is still on the Mesa with what he's got left. "Which isn't much," Gideon said, "and none of them talked." Crane said, "Who would they talk to?" Gideon said, "They'll talk to me." Crane looked at him. He said, "Mr. Cross, what exactly are you planning?" Gideon said, "I'm planning to make it so that when the federal marshal's office finally gets around to looking at this town, there's enough people willing to stand up and say what happened that it can't be buried." He paused. "I'm also planning to keep 3 children alive and off the street until that day comes." He stood up. He pulled his coat on. He said, "Which of those 2 things troubles you more, Reverend?" Crane looked at his hands. He said quietly, "The children have been sleeping in the alley behind the church. I left blankets. I couldn't bring them in. Veitch's man watches the church." He said it like a confession, which it was. Gideon said, "I know about the blankets, Reverend. June told me." He said, "Thank you for that. Genuinely." He paused at the door. "You've got more courage than you think. You just haven't been pointed in a direction yet." He walked out into the cold street. He found Harker at the livery. He found Peralta at the end of a 2-hour ride up to the Mesa in wind that had no business being that cold this early in October. Harker was angry in the quiet way old men get angry. The anger that's been sitting so long, it's solidified into something structural. Peralta was angry in the louder way, the way of a man who hasn't slept well in 2 years. Both of them, when Gideon laid it out plainly, said the same thing in different words. "I've been waiting for somebody to come." He told them about the letter to Whitmore. He told them what he needed. Statements, written, signed, specific. Names, dates, what was taken and how. And he spent the evening with Harker at his kitchen table, and the next morning with Peralta on the mesa, and he wrote everything down in the careful block letters that his mother had taught him in a schoolroom in Tennessee before everything had gone sideways. He did not tell them who he was. He did not tell them what his name meant to a federal marshal's office. He told them he was a man who had a reason to see Harlan Veitch answer for what he'd done, which was true, and that he knew how to make that happen, which was mostly true, and that he needed their help to do it, which was entirely true. Both men signed. He was back in Red Rock by nightfall, with 2 signed statements, and cold all the way through, and 3 children waiting for him behind Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, where he'd moved them 2 days ago, quietly with Mrs. Aldridge's complicated and negotiated permission. June was awake when he got back. She was always awake. Wren and Callum were asleep on the pallet he'd put together from every spare blanket in the building. He sat down on the ground next to her in the lamplight. She said, "How'd it go?" He said, "Better than expected. Worse than I'd like. That's usually how things go." She said, "Are we going to be all right?" He said, "I don't know yet. I'll tell you when I do," she said. "Most people would lie to a child. They'd say, 'Yes,' to make me feel better." He said, "Does lying to you make you feel better?" She said, "No," he said. "Then there you go." She was quiet. Then she said, "My mother used to say that honest bad news is easier to carry than a comfortable lie." She said, "You know where you stand with the truth." He said, "Aw, your mother sounds like she was a smart woman." June said, "She was the smartest person I ever knew." She said it simply and without ceremony, and it landed in the cold room like a stone in still water. He said, "June?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to get you safe. All 3 of you, whatever it costs." She said, "Why does it matter to you?" "We're not yours." He said, "No, ma'am." He said it quietly. "But I've been on the wrong side of this before. I've been in rooms where decisions got made that cost people everything, and I didn't say anything. I've been the man that knew and walked past." He paused. "Those 4 men I mentioned being wanted for." He stopped. She said, "You killed them." He said, "Yes." She said, "Were they bad men?" He said, "2 of them were. 2 of them were in the way at a bad moment, and I was not the man I should have been." He said it flatly, without excuse. "That's what I'm carrying, ma'am. That's what I've been carrying for 3 years." He looked at the 2 sleeping children. "I figure if I can put enough right things on the other side of the scale, maybe the weight of it gets manageable." June said, "That's not how it works. You can't trade good deeds for bad ones." He said, "I know that." She said, "Then why do it?" He said, "Because it's the right thing to do, even if it doesn't count." He paused. "Because your father wrote down what he knew, and it cost him everything. Because your mother sent you out the window and went back for your brother. Because people who do the right thing when it costs something deserve somebody to finish what they started." He looked at the floor. "Because I stopped in the street, and that means I'm in it now, and I don't walk away from things I'm in." He said it the last part like it was a rule, like it was the one rule he still had. June looked at him for a long time. She said, "Gideon." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet." She said, "I'm thanking you for stopping. That part's already done. Nobody can take that back." He didn't answer. He blew the lamp out. He sat in the dark against the wall with his rifle across his knees, and he listened to the sounds of the town settling into the night. Veitch came for him on the 5th morning, not Veitch himself. Veitch sent 2 men, which was how Gideon had expected it would go. Men like Veitch sent other people to do the thing that might get blood on their coat, for he met them on the main street at 7 in the morning, with the cold sun barely up over the eastern ridge, and the street mostly empty because word had gotten around, the way word always gets around in a small town, that something was about to happen. The 2 men were named Cord and Jess, as far as Gideon could piece together from what Dutch had told him the night before. Cord was the one who spoke. Cord said, "Mr. Veitch would like a word." Gideon said, "Mr. Veitch can come find me himself if he wants a word with me." Cord said, "I don't think you understand the situation, friend." Gideon said, "I think I understand it better than most." He said it without moving his hands, without moving anything. He stood in the mud of Red Rock's main street in the thin October sunlight, and he was very still the way certain things are still, not from calm, but from the particular readiness that looks like calm. Cord said, "Mr. Veitch has heard you've been talking to people. He'd like that to stop," Gideon said. "I bet he would." Cord's hand moved toward his hip. Gideon's revolver was out and leveled in the interval between Cord's decision and Cord's hand completing the gesture, which is to say before Cord had fully committed to the act. The street went very quiet. "Jess," Gideon said, without looking at Jess, "your hand moves, and I shoot your partner, and then I shoot you, and I go about my morning. You understand me?" Jess understood him. Gideon said to Cord, "You go back to Veitch. You tell him that the letters have been sent. You tell him that there are signed statements from 3 separate property owners in the hands of a postal rider heading for Denver. You tell him that the territorial marshal's office is already looking at this county because I put my name on a letter, and my name is the kind of name that gets a letter read." He holstered the revolver in one smooth motion. "You tell him that every day he spends doing anything other than getting on a horse and riding as far from Colorado as his horse will carry him is a day he's 1 step closer to a federal judge. You tell him that," Cord said. "You just signed your own death warrant," Gideon said. "I've had a standing death warrant for 3 years. I've gotten used to it." He walked back into the boarding house. Mrs. Aldridge was in the hallway. She had a shotgun. He looked at the shotgun. He looked at her. She said, "I heard." Her jaw was set in the manner of a woman who had made a decision and was not entertaining revisitations of it. He said, "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "I've been in this town for 11 years, and I've watched Harlan Veitch take everything that wasn't nailed down and some things that were." She said, "Those children have been sleeping on the floor of my back room, and that little one asked me this morning if I thought her mother could see her from wherever she was." He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I told her yes. I don't know if that's true." "But I told her yes." She gripped the shotgun. "You tell me what you need." He told her what he needed. She did every bit of it. Veitch came himself on the 7th morning. Gideon had expected this. When you cut off every intermediate option, the man at the center has to move eventually. Veitch was not what he'd expected. He was not large. He was not loud. And he was a medium-built man in a good coat, with quiet eyes, and the unhurried manner of someone who had never in his life been made to wait for anything, and could not quite process the experience of waiting now. He came with 4 men. He came to the boarding house, and he knocked on the door, which surprised Gideon, and Mrs. Aldridge opened it and said, "He's in the parlor," in the tone of a woman hosting a meeting she did not enjoy, but was committed to conducting with propriety. Gideon sat in the parlor with his revolver on the table in front of him and his hands on his knees and looked at Harlan Veitch. Veitch sat down across from him. His 4 men stayed at the door. Veitch said, "You've caused me a considerable amount of trouble, Mr. Cross." Gideon said, "That was the plan, Mr. Veitch." Veitch said, "I could have you killed before sundown." Gideon said, "You could try." Veitch said, "I don't say things I don't mean." Gideon said, "Neither do I." He said, "The marshal's office in Denver has my letters. They have the statements from Harker and Peralta. They have a sworn account from Reverend Crane of what he witnessed over the past 2 years, which he wrote out 2 nights ago, which surprised me some. I won't pretend otherwise." He paused. "You move on me, Veitch, and you've got nothing to show for it but more charges. You're already looking at conspiracy, land fraud, and 2 murders. You add a 3rd, you're not negotiating a sentence anymore. You're looking at a rope." Veitch looked at him. His quiet eyes did the calculation the way quiet eyes do, not fast, not visibly, just thoroughly. He said, "The Webb children," Gideon said, "are not your concern anymore." Veitch said, "And if I ride?" Gideon said, "Then you ride, and what happens after is between you and the federal marshal, who will absolutely come looking, regardless of where you go, because I gave them enough to look. But you ride today, and those children are safe today, and I don't come after you myself." He paused. "And I'm considerably harder to negotiate with than a federal marshal, Mr. Veitch. That is a genuine piece of advice." Harlan Veitch sat in the parlor of Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house in Red Rock, Colorado, and looked at Gideon Cross and weighed the thing in his quiet eyes and found the weight of it settled in one particular direction. He stood up. He said, "The Webb land goes back on record under the family name. I'll have my lawyer file it before I ride." Gideon said, "Today." Veitch said, "Today." He left. His 4 men left with him. Mrs. Aldridge came in from the hallway. She said, "Is it over?" Gideon said, "The hard part. The rest is paperwork." She sat down. She put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just landing. He gave her the moment. She looked up. She said, "What happens to the children?" He said, "I've been thinking about that." She said, "And?" He said, "There's a woman in Denver, a woman who ran the boarding house where I stayed when I first came west, before things went the way they went. She takes in children who need placing. She's placed 37 over the years, I know that for a fact. She's connected to the right people. She'll find the right situation for them." Mrs. Aldridge said, "What about you?" He said, "I'll take them to Denver." She said, "And then," he said, "then I figure out the next thing." She said, "You could stay." He was quiet. She said, "This town could use a man like you. Now that Veitch is gone, there's a marshal position that wants filling. A real one." Gideon Cross looked at the wall of the parlor and thought about a wanted poster with his face on it in 4 territories, and thought about Laredo, and thought about the 4 men and the weight of the scale. He said, "Let me take the children to Denver first. Then I'll think about the rest." She said, "That's not no." He said, "No, ma'am, it's not." He told the children that evening, all 3 of them in the back room, Callum half asleep against June's side, Wren sitting cross-legged with her green eyes on his face. He told them about Veitch, about the land going back in their family's name, about Denver and the woman there and the path forward. June listened to all of it. When he was done, she said, "Are you coming with us to Denver?" He said, "I'm taking you there." She said, "And after?" He said, "After is after." She said, "I want you to come back," he said, "June." She said, "I'm not asking you to be our father." She said it straight and clear. "I'm asking you to come back because this town needs somebody honest in it. Now, And you're the most honest person I've met in 4 months, and I've met some people." He said, "That may be the saddest endorsement I've ever received," Wren said, very quietly, from her cross-legged position on the floor. "She means you stopped." He looked at her. Wren said, "When everyone walked past," she said, "That's the thing." She was looking at him with those green eyes that had watched every man on that street walk past her outstretched hand. She said, "You stopped." And Gideon Cross looked at this small girl who had spent 4 weeks sitting in the mud of a street, holding out her hand, and having it ignored by every respectable man in Red Rock, Colorado, until a wanted man with 4 deaths on his conscience and a price on his head had crossed the street and crouched down in front of her. He said, "Yeah." He said it rough. "Yeah, I stopped." Wren said, "That's enough." She said it with the absolute conviction of a child who has learned to measure things by what they actually cost and not by what they look like. He put his face down for a moment. Just a moment. Then he straightened up. He said, "We leave for Denver at first light. You sleep now." Callum was already asleep. June lay down beside him. Wren stayed sitting for a moment longer, looking at him. She said, "Gideon," he said. "Yes, ma'am." She said, "My mama would have liked you." He said, "I hope so." She said, "She would have. She always said you can tell a man's character by what he does when nobody's looking." She said it mattered more than anything else. He said, "Somebody was looking. You were." Wren laid down. She pulled the blanket up. She said, "From under it." "That's why I know." He sat against the wall in the dark with his rifle across his knees, and he listened to 3 children breathe themselves into sleep. He thought about 4 men. He thought about the scale. He thought about a street in Red Rock and a small hand held out in the cold, and every man who had walked past it, and the one who hadn't. He thought, Rosa. Rosa, I stopped. He thought it the way he always thought her name, not with grief anymore, but with something quieter, something like reporting in, something like, "I'm still here and I'm still trying." The dark said nothing. But for the first time in 3 years, the silence felt less like absence and more like permission. They rode for Denver at dawn. June Webb rode straight-backed and watched the road. Callum slept against Gideon's chest in the saddle for the first 2 hours, and then woke up and asked 3 questions about horses in a row without pausing for answers, which Gideon found he did not mind at all. Wren rode behind June and watched the ridgelines and did not say much, which was her way. But twice on the road, she touched Gideon's sleeve when he rode close, just briefly, just to confirm he was still there. He was still there. Gideon Cross came back to Red Rock 6 weeks later and took the marshal's position under a legal arrangement that cost the territorial office some careful paperwork and cost him the better part of his pride, which he had decided was a fair price. He wore the star for 11 years. The Webb children found a good home in Denver and then a better life after that. June Webb became a schoolteacher. Wren Webb became a doctor. Callum Webb, when he was old enough, rode to Red Rock to find the man who had stopped in the street. He found him on the porch of the marshal's office with a cup of coffee, watching the morning. Callum said, "You probably don't remember me." Gideon said, "Callum Webb. You were 5. You slept through most of the important parts." Callum said, "June told me everything." Gideon said, "June talks too much." Callum said, "She said you spent your last money." Gideon said, "I got it back eventually." Callum said, "She said you were the most dangerous man on the street." Gideon said, "That part's probably still true." Callum looked at him for a moment. He said, "She said you stopped." Gideon drank his coffee. He said, "Somebody had to." Callum Webb sat down on the porch steps, and they watched the street together in the morning light. and the street was quiet and ordinary and clean, and that was the whole of the miracle, that it could be.